Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 10. This week, I will be sharing a conversation that I had with photographer Claire A. Warden. Claire is a photographer that I've been a fan of for a while now, ever since I saw her work at the Medium Festival of Photography a couple of years ago. So we'll get to that in just a few minutes. First thing, though, I was thinking a little bit about a little thing that came up on Facebook the other day. A friend of mine made a little post. She said, "I hate finishing good books. Now what? Life is empty." And coincidentally, I had recently finished reading a really great book. I mentioned it on the show a few episodes ago. It was by Celeste Ng. It was called Everything I Never Told You. And if you are at all interested in what I was talking about that book, you should definitely check it out. I highly recommend it. But I was thinking about this because I had been going through exactly that same feeling. And when she made that post, a bunch of her friends started recommending new books to her. But for me, whenever I finish a really great book and I have that sort of post-book hangover, I'm always a little hesitant to just jump right into a new book. And part of that is because, I am, of course, worried that the next book I read won't measure up. And in my case, the next book I read didn't really measure up, and I sort of had to quit halfway through it and move on to the next one. And the next one was much better, which was nice. But more than that, there's just a sort of feeling that there's something about the story that I have to sit with a little while. If it's something that has affected me deeply, I almost feel like I have to honor that feeling a little bit more, spend a little more time with it. It's kind of a strange thing to think about, but in a lot of ways, reading a really great book can feel more real than real life in some ways. And the emotions that you go through can be very affecting in ways that your day-to-day life, might have, but might not. Everybody has a tendency, you got your routine, you go to work, you take a shower in the morning, go to bed at night. You might not, experience that same drama that you get in a really great story. Realistically, that's probably a good thing. When if your life were really that dramatic, it would probably be pretty hard to deal with. But I think that in a lot of ways, the emotions that you get experiencing a story like that are just as real as the ones that you would get in real life. And even though they are something that you can experience more safely with fewer consequences than you might have in a real life dramatic situation, there's still something about it that, it does affect you, and you do want to kind of sit with it a little bit. Anyway, just something I was thinking about a little bit. If you've read any really great books lately, something that made you have to sit on it for a few days before you could move on to the next book, why don't you drop me a line, let me know. Podcast at keepthechanneleopen.com. Anyway, on to today's show. As I said, today's guest is photographer Claire A. Warden. And Claire is, I'm definitely a big fan of Claire's work. I remember the first time I saw her newer body of work, Mimesis. She was, as I mentioned, she was showing it at the Medium Festival of Photography, where I was also participating and having my portfolio reviewed. And we were at the open portfolio walk, just sort of a chance for the artists who are having their work reviewed to share what it is that they are getting reviewed with each other and with the public. And I stopped by her table, and she just had these what to me at the time seemed pretty big prints, although in the since then she's been printing them even bigger. But there are these big prints that you come up to them, you don't really know what you're looking at. They look like clouds, like stars, like maybe x-rays or biological cultures. And I remember just my jaw kind of dropping and just I had to stop and sort of gush over them a little bit. I remember one of them I said it looked kind of like something like a medieval map of the firmament or something that should have a little scroll on the side of it that says "Here there be dragons." But it definitely was something that those images have stuck with me ever since then, and so I was really happy to get the chance to talk to her about her work. We talked about that body of work, Mimesis. We also talked about an earlier body of work of hers that I had also been familiar with called SALT, Studies in Preservation and Manipulation. I've linked both of those in the show notes, so I encourage you to check those out. And if you do ever get the chance to see her work in person, she's been showing it here and there all over Southern California and the Southwest and in other places as well. And so if she ever has an exhibition nearby you, I highly recommend it, because seeing her prints in person is certainly a much different experience than seeing these small versions on screen. In any case, here is my conversation with Claire A. Warden. So, let me think. The first time that I can remember seeing your work was at SDAI for the Art of Photography show. I think you had one of your SALT pieces was in that show.
Yeah. Oh, that was a long time ago.
Yeah, I think this would have been like maybe 4 or 5 years ago, something like that. And I had seen that work on Lens Scratch shortly before that exhibition, and I remember it stood out to me just because I'd seen it already. So it was sort of like that was kind of an odd show, I thought. It was kind of all over the place.
Yeah, it was really eclectic.
Yeah. But it was cool getting to that was probably one of the first sort of large-ish openings that I'd been to in San Diego. And it was neat sort of seeing the variety. But so I was thinking about that work, and I just earlier today gone back and looked at that Lens Scratch feature again, and I was thinking about the sort of two bodies of your work that I'm familiar with, the SALT photographs and Mimesis. And like obviously the first thing that jumps out is that you seem to definitely be drawn to sort of alternative processes and that kind of thing. And I was just kind of wondering, I hope if this question isn't too obvious, but just what initially drew you to sort of working in sort of a different format than is sort of more popular right now, I guess.
Well, for the SALT work, the title of that series is SALT, Studies in Preservation and Manipulation.
Mm-hmm.
And for that work, it was two things. I really wanted to consider a process that it matched the conceptual ideas that I had.
Mm-hmm.
So part of the idea of that work is this futility in cataloging and preserving things. Mm-hmm. So to kind of emphasize that I was using a process that is one of the most chemically stable processes in photographic history. Mm-hmm. Platinum printing is super stable. But I also needed to choose a process that was practical for me at the time, because I was just graduating from undergrad and I wasn't going to have access to a digital lab or a darkroom. And I ended up moving to Los Angeles. And so I needed a process that I could do in my studio apartment. Mm-hmm. And that process I did in, I think it probably was less than 3 by 3 feet wide or square closet. And I made that whole body of work in a closet of my studio apartment. Because it didn't need to, you don't have to have a totally black space to work in, aside from developing the film, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And then I developed everything outside. So, or I exposed everything outside, and I developed and fixed everything in my bathroom. So,
yeah.
It was practical. It was a practical reason too that I went for an alternative process with that series.
Yeah, that wouldn't have occurred to me, but like, the thing that you're talking about, that particular series, really, in some ways, it sort of, to me, gets at the medium itself, because photography is so, just as a medium, so involved with time and preservation. And the angle that you had, the concept that you had for that work, with the preserved botanical specimens, it makes for a real juxtaposition of ephemerality and stability, with the process that you're using. And that was just something that seemed really fascinating, that you can consider it on more than one level.
Yeah. Yeah, and in that series, it was the futility of trying to save something was really important to me, and that's the reason that I ended up using salt, because salt is a preservative. Mm-hmm. But of course, if you outweigh the delicate balance of how much salt intake something that's living has, it extinguishes it. So it preserves color, shape, and texture, but it ends up covering these botanical specimens in this case. It just encapsulates it in this crystalline structure. And so you might have preserved it under the structure, but it's a totally different form now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And the way that the photographs look too, because they have sort of an old-fashioned feel, sort of an antique kind of feel to them, that seems to work really nicely as well with that concept, because you do sort of, even though the photographs are not like vintage photographs, you made them at that time, but they sort of had that feeling of being, of something that you would have, sort of happened across at like a flea market or something, like that they have a sense of history to them already. At least that's how they read to me.
Yeah, that's nice. I usually think of them as really quiet.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
So your question about process, I think you asked me what led me to working with processes that are kind of not necessarily mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I can talk to you about Mimesis.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of that work. That was a couple years ago now that I first saw it, and you really can't help but just be struck by it immediately, because it's really not what one normally thinks of when one thinks of photography. But yeah, I'd love to hear more about it.
Yeah, so I don't generally share this, but it's because we were talking about salt, the salt series. Mm-hmm. This could be a nice link maybe. But so when I was working on that series in my studio apartment, I would have these blank sheets of film, and I can't really explain to you why I would go through the process of developing a piece of film that I knew had nothing on it. I guess I preferred to look at something that was gray or black as opposed to something that was purple, mm-hmm. and maybe like is still exposing. But I would use these blank sheets of film, and I would use it as the template for when I coded on my platinum chemistry.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd position this blank sheet of film on my paper, and I'd draw an outline, and then I'd remove it, and then I'd coat my chemistry on it, and then I'd put the real negative on it once it had dried. So I had these sheets of 4x5 that were developed with nothing on them, because they were just these templates lying around my apartment. And when I had finished this series, or when I felt like it was finished, well, actually, I went to an artist residency in France, and that residency really pushed me to make work immediately.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't really have time to think of, is the process conceptually right for the work? Or, what am I actually photographing here? It's just like, make work. You have 5 weeks, and then we had a show. So I had this really liberating experience of letting go of preconceived ideas, or it was really freeing.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I came back from this residency, I kind of had this openness to, and then like a kind of a flexibility with the medium that I didn't really have before, because generally before I was really rigid. I have to develop my film perfectly. I have to make this print perfect. And then I came back with this openness. And then I saw all these pieces of film lying around that I had been using for my templates. And I wanted to experiment with that film. Mm-hmm. I wanted to know what were the limits of the material? How far can I push this material? And at what point is it still a photograph or not?
Mm-hmm.
Or does that even matter, because I'm using photographic materials?
Right.
So I had done a few different experiments with these templates, and one of them was applying my saliva to the film. And I didn't know what was going to happen. And when I saw what had happened, and I did these experiments, and I left them alone for about a month,
mm-hmm.
and came back, and I didn't even really know what I was looking at first. And then I realized, the saliva had actually etched through the film. This film, black and white film at least, is silver and gelatin on a plastic substrate.
Mm-hmm.
So I realized that the digestive enzymes in the saliva had etched through the gelatin, and what was left over after this film had dried was my biologic matter and silver halides
mm-hmm.
from the developed film. And out of the other things that I had done, that was the one that resonated with me the most. And I think it was because I was really starting to consider this question that is now the central question of this work, which is, what are you?
Mm-hmm.
And that was the question I was kind of exploring, how I answer that question, and what informs my answer, rather, and why do I get asked this question, and or even just why do certain people get asked this question and not other people, and it just kind of met. They just kind of met at the same time, where I was considering these questions, and I had done this experiment on this piece of film, and I realized not only does saliva have digestive enzymes, but it has DNA, and maybe this is the best representation of myself I can make.
Yeah. I mean, these pictures, they're really not like anything that I can think of having seen before. And it's not just, it's what I find really fascinating about them is not, I mean, like just visually, I mean, they're really wonderfully textural, which is something that's very hard to pull off photographically. But also, like, it's this really neat combination of what looks like, and as you're saying, is sort of uncontrollable, sort of chaotic and unplanned, mixed with marks that are obviously very intentional, like the lines or the ways that in some of the images are sort of occluded with straight lines or iris shapes or things like that. And the idea of having something that where you don't fully have control over it is just really, it's something that, I don't know, when I think about that in terms of my own work, it's something that is kind of feels kind of almost dangerous, you know?
Yeah.
And I find that that's something, I've mentioned this when I've talked to a couple other people, that photographers seem like, just as a group, tend towards wanting to have that control more than other artists, maybe. So it's really, seeing you make this work in a way that is so both of those things, where it's a combination of intention and chaos is it stands out in the medium. And yeah, and also the thing too, like you mentioned this thing where the question of whether it is a photograph or not. And that is a question that really seems to come up a lot with a lot of different kinds of work, where I feel like right now we're sort of in this interesting moment in photography as an art form where people are really interested in a lot of different kinds of work. Like you see people making photograms or other types of cameraless work. And yours really goes to like the next step beyond that, where it's cameraless, but it's also, like, unlike a photogram, it's completely non-representational, which is not something that you'd normally think of with photography.
Yeah.
But like I can't imagine somebody coming in and seeing this work, especially the prints that I've seen more recently where you made them really big. Like, they really just stop you dead in your tracks,
Yeah, that's my intention with the size. I really want it to feel like an experience, because so much of this work is based on personal experiences. And I really like that you say non-representational. That's like a really important distinction, I think, in this work. It's easy to call this work abstract.
Right.
But the more that I think about it, I really just don't find it to be abstract. It is non-representational,
right.
Because it's not so abstract that there's nothing there, because there really is something there. It's just not a clear representation of what it is, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the thing about photography being, the understanding that most people, even most artists, have about photography, even people thinking about it relatively sophisticatedly, where you do still see most people, when they think about photography, thinking about it in terms of it being a reference to something that was in front of a lens, and this isn't that at all.
Yeah, I've shown this work to some people, and sometimes, maybe a couple times, I've been asked, well, so this work is non-representational, and there's no image on the film, so why does this have to be photography? Why can't this be a drawing or a painting or a sculpture? And I really enjoy that question because at first I didn't know how to answer it. And then I have had to really think about like, why is this photography? Why is it important that people know it's photography? Or why is it important that I'm using photographic film, and why am I not painting?
Mm-hmm.
And then I realized that a lot of people, when they know that it's in a photographic context and they know that it's photography, they want to know what it is. So usually the first question is, what am I looking at?
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that question it comes from the same place as, what are you? It's the same kind of idea where, you feel like you should be able to tell what something is, but it's just a little too ambiguous. But you need to know.
Yeah.
You have to know.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's definitely that sort of human impulse to want to categorize things. And what it seems to me with these pictures that, because they are so different from what you would normally think of as photography, even just in the way that you're working them, whether it's with the fluids or with the ways that you're manually etching them, that the process of creating them is so different. But one of the things that is very similar, or really exactly the same as, maybe not so much with digital photography, but with analog film photography, that, one of the things about film photography that's always struck me as one of the really valuable things about that, and this is particularly true with like tintypes or other one-of-a-kind type photographs, but the negative with film was something that was actually present in the space where you were taking the picture, and so there's sort of this sort of more physical connection, temporal and physical connection. And then with this body of work, you're making that even more literal by using your saliva, that this is actually something where the film has a direct connection, a direct physical and temporal connection to when you were working it. And that seems to me to be like a really sort of crucial thing in understanding the work, this particular body of work, and how that relates to the conceptual underpinnings of it.
Yeah. I mean, I should mention that I don't think I did really explicitly say this, but each negative has saliva. It goes through this process of having saliva on the negative.
Mm-hmm.
And then once that process is finished, then I do interact with the piece using common tools. So, and it's usually in an additive or subtractive way.
Mm-hmm.
So scissors, tape, X-Acto knives, ink, those sorts of things. And I really enjoy being able to work with the negative in a way that's not so finite. Generally, there's so many processes in photography that are so finite. Mm-hmm. And it kind of ties into the technical part of photography. It's like we're taught classically, I guess, to make this perfect exposure. And then once you do that, then you develop your film, and then you're done working with the film and you can use it to make your print. And then you make this perfect print, and then your print is done. You frame it, you put it on the wall. That's it. Mm-hmm. It's like this process that we're taught. And working with film this way, if I have done something to the film and it's not right, then I keep working on it until it is right. And sometimes pieces take 2 months, and sometimes they take a year.
Yeah.
And so it's nice to know that anything that I feel like wasn't executed the way that I anticipated, is the life of that negative isn't over.
Yeah. I was actually just talking to let's see, this would have been this past weekend, and this will be the episode that airs right before this one, I guess. And where I was talking to this guy who does, his name's TML Dunn, and he works in a bunch of different media, but a lot of what he does is he does a lot of paintings and drawings in addition to some sculptural stuff. And we were talking about how painting and photography sort of work differently in the process. And I was listening to you talk about this body of work. You're really approaching it in a way that sounds more like the way painters talk about their work.
Yeah, I do approach it that way. I feel that way often. I always thought I was going to be a painter since I was a little kid. And it wasn't until I was in high school, and it's actually kind of a funny story, but I was the president of the art club when I was in high school. And I wanted to enroll in a photo class, and I went into my high school photo lab, and the photo professor, I asked him if I could sign up, and he said, "I know who you are. You're the president of the art club. You think you can just come in here and take a photo class?"
Jeez.
And he said he would not let me enroll. I think it was going to be for my junior year. Mm-hmm. And he said he wouldn't let me enroll for that semester or whatever, unless I came in after school and taught myself how to develop film and make a print to prove that I really wanted to take a photo class with him. And then he would let me take his photo class.
Jeez.
So that's what I ended up doing for, 4 months or 5 months. I was teaching myself after school how to develop film, and, because I was doing it myself, his horrible first roll of film was totally, it was not exposed at all. And it was this trying experience, and then conquering it. And it was really pretty dramatic. And then I ended up getting into the class, and that was the beginning of my love for photography. It just completely changed my world. It allowed me to express myself in a way that I never had been able to in any other medium. And it's exciting to see, or to find a way to have that really tactile, slow process of painting or drawing in photography, which sometimes is kind of fast.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, to me, that's one of the defining things about working in photography is that, because the execution side of it is relatively quick. I mean, even if you're, working an image, post-processing an image digitally, you're not really typically spending a lot of time on it compared to, what a painter would spend, a few days at most, maybe. And maybe that would be a little more for your typical darkroom photographer. Might have to spend more time working a picture, in the darkroom. But even so, it seems unusual to spend months at a time on a single image, where a painter typically, that wouldn't be particularly unusual for a painter. And having this way of having that slower interaction, I guess that really it really changes the nature of the way you as the creator are engaging with the work as well. Yeah, I mean that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was talking about agency in photography specifically too. I've been talking about it kind of recently, and I think it's really important. I think this kind of goes along with what you're saying, but I think it's really important, and it's easily forgotten, is the act of creating in photography. I think, especially because it's so prevalent in news media, that we tend to take the subject of the photograph as information, as opposed to acknowledging that it was created by someone.
Yeah. I mean,
and
yeah.
It's different from what I'm doing, of course, because a friend of mine told me that she looks in my photographs for my fingerprints. So it's a little different because I'm really, really working with the materials, but this work is so important. The agency is so important to this work that it helps me remember that every photograph is created. Every photograph is framed and composed and waiting for that moment to make the photograph. It's made by someone, and ultimately I think it says more about the photographer than it does about the subject.
Yeah, I mean, certainly in the best ones it does. That's, for myself, that's always something that I'm hoping to get across. But it's also often a limitation of the audiences, I feel like sometimes, that we have such an understanding of photography Whoa.
Did you hear that?
Yeah. But that we have such an understanding of photography in so many different contexts other than just art, that, whether it's photojournalism or commercial photography, advertising, or, vacation snaps or whatever, that and most of those are really engaging the photograph as just a stand-in for the thing itself, so that you're not actually engaging with the photograph as a photograph. And I think that we're so, as a society, conditioned to think of photography in that way, that it can be really difficult for just the audience member off the street to engage with when if it's something like more like what I'm doing, where I have a subject of the photograph, but the art is really in what's behind the photograph and not actually shown. And that's what I want to try to get across to people, is what's not in the photograph, the emotion around it. That can be really difficult, I think, for people to understand, to look for,
Yeah. Yeah. That's why I'm so glad that I think there's so many experiments, at least in my experience, there's so many experiments that I've done and I've moved on from before I even knew what they were capable of. And I'm really glad to be working with, have continued working with this initial experiment into this body of work, because I think it's the only way that I can make this work.
I mean, it's powerful stuff. And, I guess one thing I do want to kind of ask you is, because there is sort of a school of criticism of which I do not subscribe, and I tend to I have been known to yell about at times, but but there is sort of a school of photographic thinking that says that if it's not something that's in the photograph, if you can't get like if it has to have any words associated with it, then the photograph isn't successful, which I personally feel is a very limiting way of looking at any kind of art, not just photography. But I think, with your work, the conceptual underpinnings of the work of this body of work is really potent. It's very, hearing you talk about it, the relationship of, what is it to what are you? To somebody like me, that is something that it's a very visceral and resonant question, right? And it's something that, looking at your work, I can really understand how the two are related. But just looking at it without having had you explain that, at least, or even to just mention that, I don't know if I would have gotten there. And I'm not sure, even though it's the resonance is there, I don't know if you could necessarily get there without having been told it. Mm-hmm. To me, that doesn't matter at all. But it is the kind of thing where I wonder, is that the kind of thing that, have you gotten that criticism before, or how do you deal with it if you do?
I haven't had that criticism exactly like that, but I guess writing about your work is important, I think, and having written work with non-representational work is especially important. But I hope that people can enjoy the work without knowing what it's about. So I think that's kind of, it's just part of making non-representational work. Mm-hmm. And whether you know about it or you don't, I think you can still decide that you like one and you don't like another, and maybe you know why, or maybe you don't know why. And that actually is something that's something that I enjoy learning about, when people see the work and they maybe haven't read the artist statement or they haven't heard me speak about it. So usually that happens in an exhibition, when I'm having an exhibition and people come to an opening and I'm there, and people talk to me about why one resonates with them. And that for me is an important part of the work. When people don't know the conceptual underpinnings of the work and they're just purely reacting to these different creations of mine. Mm-hmm. Because I think that is a really important psychological part of this work, is that, we can pretty much make a judgment about anything without really knowing anything about it. Mm-hmm. And that can happen to people too. Right. So, sometimes you can tell that you've been judged before someone even knows who you are. Yeah. And because I see these pieces as small representations of myself, I like to hear when somebody just reacts, when somebody just likes one and doesn't like another one. Mm-hmm. And that might not be enjoyable for anyone else. But because I hope most people want to know more. Yeah. And then that's where it comes in that I can explain it. And the thing is even if I explain it to everybody, not everyone is it's not going to resonate with everyone. And some people won't understand it and some people will. And it's harder for someone to understand who has never been approached based on their likeness and questioned about it. Yeah. I just don't know if you could ever, I gave a lecture, I think this was when I was giving a lecture at the Center for Fine Art Photography, and somebody came up after and was just shocked that someone would ask, "What are you?" They just they just didn't understand who would do that and why.
Yeah. But I mean, that's like just the reality of living for lots of people. Certainly I get that question all the damn time.
Right. Yeah. And so it's, even if I do explain it, people can know more about it, I guess, but maybe not everyone completely understands it because it could be just such a foreign experience.
Yeah. Although, I mean, I think that art, it has the potential for sort of, especially when you're talking about sort of a really specific type of experience that you're embodying in your work, there, with that particular experience, for somebody like me who is very, very familiar with that question and how it makes you feel and know that experience of living in the kind of society where looking the way I look or looking the way that you look is going to prompt that kind of question. That's something where seeing that represented in the work is resonant because it's familiar. But I also think that, the power of art to communicate has an aspect where you can, hopefully if people are open to it, some people, definitely not all people, but some people will, even if they don't fully get it, will get part of it, and their experience will be broadened by having had exposure to your experience, which is, I think, really valuable. I mean, it's, I think, really one of the most valuable things that art does, because the way that we are all very similar in ways, but we all have our own unique experiences, and there's no way to directly access anyone else's experience. So it's only through communication that we can do that. And art is about communication.
Yeah. And that's certainly a goal that I have for this work, is to, if nothing else, start a dialogue about this, even if it's not completely understood by everyone who sees it. But kind of getting back to your question before, it's something that I've thought about a lot because, I want people to understand what's happening and why. So writing about it and showing it and being there and talking to people is really, really important for this work.
Yeah.
Because you're right. It doesn't communicate immediately what it's saying necessarily.
Yeah. I mean, and this work, I mean, it's so visually striking that, I mean, you can appreciate it on just that level. And I mean, really the most successful work in any medium, in any genre, is that work that you can appreciate on many different levels, where you can just approach it completely visually or aesthetically or whatever, and not dig deeper, and still find it to be a very moving experience. And these are so evocative of, like space or biology, or any number of different themes that just pop out at you looking at it. You can do that without hearing the statement and still, have a really meaningful experience with it. But having the statement on top of that just takes it to the next level. And I think that is something where, being able to have many different kinds of experience with a piece, that is what really ends up bringing people back to it and making it meaningful.
Yeah.
So for the second segment, I always ask everyone to bring a topic of their own, something that they're interested in talking about. And the thing you mentioned was about being an immigrant and how that affects identity formation, which, I mean, that's something that is a topic near and dear to my heart. But yeah, why don't you get us started? What are you thinking?
Yeah, so it was actually pretty hard for me to think of a second topic that I felt like I knew enough about to talk about. Somebody asked me what kind of books were on my nightstand, and I mentally went through the books that were on my nightstand, and every single one was about photography.
Mm-hmm.
So I was trying to broaden it a little bit by not talking about photography specifically. So I thought it would be interesting just to talk about my experience of being an immigrant, and especially now, because I feel like immigrant is almost like a dirty word.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's important to remember that immigrants come from everywhere,
Right.
even Canada.
Right.
So, and I was thinking about this earlier, and I grew up in Montreal, in Canada, in Montreal, Quebec, and I went to an all French speaking school. And when I moved to the United States, I was not a very good English speaker. I distinctly remember I was conjugating English verbs like you would in French, which does not work
Right.
that way. And going home and telling my parents about some English verb that I had learned about, and they believed me, I think. Or at least in my child mind, I was like, they believed me. Mm-hmm. And it was totally conjugated wrong. Like, so, and Montreal is such a culturally diverse city. Mm-hmm. And we moved from Montreal to Phoenix, Arizona, which 20 years ago there wasn't very much going on in Phoenix. Mm-hmm. I was talking to my mom, and she said she remembers having to drive, I think she said 25 minutes to go find one sushi restaurant. That's like the one sushi restaurant in Phoenix.
Right.
So it was not only a culture shock, but I personally had a language barrier, because we spoke French at home, and I spoke French at school. And when I moved here, this is part of why this question, what are you, kind of lingered and struck me so deeply. I think because when I first heard it, I thought I didn't understand the question.
Right.
I thought, this is a language barrier. This is some sort of English slang that I don't understand. And then after a while, I realized that it's not a language barrier, of course, but there were certain experiences where, I was like, this can't be the question somebody is asking me.
Yeah.
So I guess I kind of wanted to just talk about some of these strange experiences of being an immigrant. And I was talking to somebody from New York and kind of telling them some of my experiences having moved from Montreal to Phoenix, and they were convinced that some of these scenarios never would have happened in New York. So, so I'm not necessarily saying that this is, an American experience for an immigrant. This is just an experience that I had as an immigrant.
Yeah. I mean, I suspect, and granted, I didn't grow up anywhere in New York, but I suspect that, based on my own experience, and based on the experiences of other people I've talked to about it, and the reading that I've done, and even just people I know on Twitter, but this I think is a very common experience for immigrants, for people who are not necessarily easily placed ethnically, or even if you are, I think that experience is not really limited to a particular geographic region. It might be worse or better in different parts of the U.S., but I'm not even really sure if that's true. People tend to think of New York as a very, progressive, open-minded kind of place, but, it is and it isn't. A lot of people will tell you that it's not like the Northeast or the West Coast lacks racism. It just happens in a different way. And it's the kind of racism that is usually coded in a way such that the people doing it don't even really realize that what they're being is racist, And that question, what are you? I don't think that is the kind of question that most people who are asking it would realize is kind of racist, or maybe really racist, but it's because they are not necessarily, having never been asked that question themselves, are not necessarily going to think about how dehumanizing that is,
Mm-hmm.
Like when you get asked that question, I don't know how you feel, but like for me, when people ask me that question, it's like, it makes you feel like I'm not like an extraterrestrial here, man. I'm just a person.
Yeah, I totally understand. And I hope that the intention of that question generally is, what's your ethnic background, or where are your parents from? And when I was a kid, because I was a pretty polite kid, so when I was a kid, I would answer it as if it had been asked more thoughtfully.
Mm-hmm.
But then when I got older, I started getting kind of tired of that question. And tired of people looking at me objectively, or in an objectifying way.
Right.
And so I remember once I answered that question, and I said, what am I? I'm carbon and water and calcium and phosphorus. Which was very confusing.
Right.
But but even without being totally facetious, answering the question as a naturalized, like by saying I'm a naturalized American or I'm a Canadian, usually the next question is, well, but what are you really?
Yeah, exactly.
Or even once I told somebody I was Canadian, and they said, "Oh, I never would have guessed you were Canadian." Yeah. And it just struck me so, it was such a weird thing to say, because that meant, I guess, that they had some idea of what a Canadian is supposed to look like.
Yeah.
And I didn't fit that mold either.
Right.
So it's like, it's hard to talk sometimes. It's hard to talk about ethnicity. I don't know. For some people, it's just hard to talk about it.
Yeah.
And when they try to, it just comes out inappropriate.
Yeah.
And I hope that, like, I'm giving people the benefit of the doubt, by saying, like, you want to initiate a dialogue about where my parents are from, because I'm Canadian, and that doesn't answer your question.
Right.
But maybe it's just hard to navigate for some people.
Yeah.
Tactfully.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly, when people ask me that question, I just answer the implied question usually. But because like if somebody says like, well, where are you from? And I'll say, well, I'm from California. I'm from Northern California. And then they'll say, okay, well, where are your parents from? I say, well, they're from Northern California too. Okay, well, where are their parents from? Well, actually, my family has lived here for 125 years. How long has yours lived here? And that's usually just at that point, it like then the person has just like, that guy is angry and I'm not going to talk to him anymore. But so I don't usually go there with people. Yeah. And I do recognize that, this is a kind of thing where people aren't trying to be offensive, but I think people don't really realize how exhausting it is to have to deal with that over and over again,
Yeah.
And on some level, it's like, how much does it matter? I mean, because when you talk about identity, I don't know, like, certainly the fact that I'm a Japanese American person has colored my experience in ways that are really integral to who I am now. And that's both in, whatever cultural traditions my family might have, but a lot of it also has to do with how other people who are not Japanese treat me and have treated me for my whole life. So then that is going to inform a lot of how I think about myself and how I relate to people. But I think, like with you, we've talked a bunch of times, having met at festivals or at openings before, and I have never asked you that question, and yet I don't feel like our conversation has lacked for it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think part of why that question was so frustrating, and it still is frustrating to answer. And part of it is that when somebody asks you, what are you? They don't want to sit down and have coffee and hear your whole like ancestral background. Right. They want like a quick answer, like Indian. Mm-hmm. And then they can go on with their day. But that's the hard part, because at least for me, it's a really hard question to answer.
Right.
I mean, aside from the fact that I just don't really want to answer that question right. worded that way, I'd prefer to answer something like, what's your family's ethnic background or something like that. But even then, I went to India. My dad is Indian, and my mom, she's Canadian, but she has a really strong English background. And I went to India 8 years ago. That was the first time I had been to India. And I had this really incredible experience. Like, it felt familiar. And that was the first time I had ever traveled somewhere that I had never been before, and it felt familiar in this really, really surreal kind of way. But I had this underlying feeling that I wouldn't fit in there either.
Yeah.
It's like when I'm in the United States or some other North American country, when I'm in the United States or Canada, it's like, well, you're kind of brown. So what are you? And then it's like, well, I'm Indian. And in India, it's like, well, you're kind of fairer skinned. So what are you?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like, in India, I might be considered more English than Indian, and in the United States, I'm more Indian than whatever else. And even that is not a completely satisfying answer, because my dad is Indian. He was born in Bombay, but my grandfather, his dad, was born in Colombo in Sri Lanka, and my grandmother is from Karachi, Pakistan. So
yeah,
it doesn't really, my family is so diverse that it's like really hard to just even pick one answer.
Yeah. And that's why that question is really, at the root of it, why it's a problematic question, because if you answer that question, like if you tell someone you're Indian, or if I tell someone I'm Japanese, then, like, that's going to direct the way they think about you and treat you. And like, like the only good thing about, like, I shouldn't put it that way, but like have seen this happen to like my cousins who are women, where like they get that question and they'll like immediately, especially if it's from like some dude, like it'll be like, oh, I just find Asian women so exotic, and it's like it's really gross, and
Yeah.
for me, it'll be like, oh, they'll oftentimes it'll be like some person who, if that's the idea they hit on, they're like, oh, I love anime, or I love sushi. And it's like, I mean, I like anime and sushi too, but it's not like who I am exactly, or it's not like all of who I am, certainly.
Right.
But that thing that you were saying too about, having a diverse background and not really fitting in anywhere. I mean, that is something that for me, that's like my whole experience of life, because so my family, I'm actually only 3/4 Japanese, and my mother's father was Caucasian. His family came from like Arkansas and Missouri, and mostly English, I guess, is what the family lore is. But this is one of these things where people here cannot see that about me at all. They just look at me and see a completely Asian guy. And I know that when I go, I've never been to Japan, but I've been to Taiwan, and I've been to certainly Japanese parts of town in like San Francisco or LA. And when I'm among those people, like, it's really clear they can tell that I'm not completely Japanese, and so I don't fit in there. And on top of that, my family, like I say, my family moved here, came to California in like 1890. So
Wow.
they've been here for a really, really long time, longer than most white people's families have been in California. And so culturally, that is something that, like being Asian is something, being Japanese was definitely a part of my experience growing up, but in many ways, I'm not really very similar I'm a lot more similar to white people culturally, than I am to people from Japan. And this is something, when you talk about how identity forms, this is something I've been thinking about a lot lately, because so much of my identity has to do with feeling excluded from both sides of my heritage, and feeling like the only other person I know who's like me ethnically is my brother, And I remember I wrote about this once, but there was this time when I was a little kid, maybe it was even when I was in high school. My mom said to me that when she knew she was going to be having kids with my dad who is fully Japanese and she's half Japanese, that she thought, well, at least they'll know what they are, because that was something that she had always struggled with so much, because she's sort of ethnically ambiguous looking. The most common thing people think of her is that she's Native American or Mexican.
Interesting.
And she thought, well, at least they'll know what they are when it came to me and my brother. Except that, like, it's never really that simple,
Right.
Because when it comes down to it, so much of what culture you are allowed to access has less to do with what you are genetically, and more to do with what you're not, and how other people let you in or don't let you in. So, like, I have ancestry that goes back to England, supposedly, and so at least genetically I could say, well, like, I have access to Shakespeare. Shakespeare is of my people, or I could say that I don't know, the Tale of Genji is of my people, But
Yeah.
like on some level, like both white people and Japanese people tend to be like, white people are like, well, you're Asian, so you're not one of us. And Japanese people are like, oh, you're such a banana. You're white on the inside and yellow on the outside, you know? And so I'm not allowed to access either of those really. And so I just end up in this in-between space. That was going on for a long time. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it reminded me of this interview I was listening to with, I'm totally spacing on his name, but he's the new Late Show host from South Africa.
Oh, Trevor Noah.
Yeah. And he had some really interesting things to say about, I mean, he would just, I think he was talking about his first time coming to the U.S. and I think this was him. I hope I'm remembering this right, but I think he was talking on NPR about this experience when he came to the United States, and he had to fill out some form, and it was like, you know, fill out what your ethnicity is, and you know, it has like the regular stuff like black, white, Asian, other. I think there was an other on there. He was like, the woman was like, okay, just like, you know, fill it out however you would. And he was like, I can choose anything. Because he was saying, you know, they don't do that in South Africa. You don't have to say you're one thing or another. And he's like, so I think he said his mother is black and his father is white, or maybe it's vice versa, but it's, and he was like, so I could choose black. and the woman he's talking to is like, yeah, you could definitely do that. And then he's like, no, I'm going to choose white. And because, you know, that's both of those are part of him. And, you know, I think in the United States, it's easier, or it's not easier, but it's kind of, I guess it's just kind of forced upon you to choose the ethnicity that is more obvious.
Right.
Physically.
Yeah.
And I just really loved that he, you know, was like, no, I'm going to choose white today. You know, because, I mean, it is kind of that subjective. But then, you know, part of this is deeply American. And I think that little survey where you have to fill out what your ethnicity is and you have to choose between, you know, 5 different options that's part of a problem.
Yeah. I think in the most recent census, in the 2010 census, they finally started letting people pick more than one box. And that I read something, I can't remember what it was. It was I think it was on the NPR Code Switch blog, where they were talking about how in every census ever, the racial and ethnic part of the form has been different every single time. So like every 10 years for 200 years.
Wow.
And how people are interacting with those categories now, especially now that the government is allowing you to put more than just one for yourself, is interesting in what that reveals about what people think about themselves. But I can't remember what the conclusions were that they had there. So,
yeah. Well, I also heard something that, maybe parts of Europe or all of Europe doesn't allow that type of survey because they think it's racist.
Yeah.
Or it can lead to racism, or that information can be used for something that would lead towards like a racist action.
Yeah. It's sort of a tough thing because, you know, what I think a lot of people misunderstand about racism, at least in the United States, is that, you know, a lot of people who don't have to deal with racism in their own lives, whether it's overt or implicit, whether it's just bias or whether it's something more structural, will tell you, like, when they think of racism, they think of it as just treating people differently based on race, which is not completely wrong, but that separating that from the power structures inherent in the society and what's been, like, actually codified legally, and what the outcomes are for different races, that has a lot more to do with why it's a problem. That just treating somebody differently based on their race isn't in itself racist, but it kind of has to do with who has power and who's excluding people from having power. And so on the one hand, I kind of feel like I can get why people might feel like, you know, why do we even have those boxes on there? But on the other hand, you know, I also feel like, you know, race in this country is so much about property and access to capital and access to other resources, that there's not really any way, there's no path to equality that doesn't involve action. You know, the phrase affirmative action comes from a recognition that you can't just remove obstacles and expect things to get better, that you actually have to do something affirmative and take action in order to get to equality, because the status quo, because money and power are self-reinforcing. And if you just leave things the way they are but take away the obstacles, that won't matter, because people because those things just feed back into themselves, and rich get richer and poor get poorer, and the same with power. And that if you don't have any way of actually knowing things like what the racial distribution is in different neighborhoods, or among different economic strata, then you can't really craft any kind of policies that would address those inequities, you know?
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I mean, I see why it's tricky too, because, you know, that kind of information in the hands of a corrupt government could be used for evil things.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned, like, you know, racism doesn't necessarily have to be somebody who's acting negatively towards a specific race, but that just reminded me of this experience that I had when I was a kid, and I don't know, I was at some department store, and this isn't overtly racist, but it was just this strange experience where I was at a department store with my mom, and I remember, like, when I was with my mom and my dad as a kid, these sorts of situations wouldn't always happen. It was far less likely to happen, because they'd see, oh, brown guy, you know, white woman, and then, like, kind of brown kids, like, get it, right. Got it. But when I would go places with my mom, I'd have people come up to me, or my mom. I had this one woman come up to me, and she asked me where my mom was, and my mom was like 2 or 3 feet away from me. Mm-hmm. You know, or I remember people coming up to my mom and asking her if she was watching me and my brother, or if she was the grandmother or something, you know, like, it was these strange encounters where the person who's coming up and asking these questions it never even occurred to them that my mother could be married to an Indian man.
Right.
You know, so, and that's not an overtly racist action, but, or verbalization, but it's also not not completely thoughtful.
Right. And it reminds you, like, the only thing that you can take away from that, especially as a child, is as a reminder of you not being the same as what those people were expecting, not being the same as them. And that kind of thing, it really, everybody that I know who is, a person of color, whether they are, of one ethnic background or they are a mixed race, like every single person I know that has had some kind of experience like that, and in youth and as adults. And I think unless you go through that, you can't really understand how deeply that affects, like, the way that you see, like, all other people, and the way that it affects your relationships, your friendships, and the way that you even see yourself. It's really, it's pervasive.
It can lead to artwork.
Yeah. Yeah. Hopefully, in the best cases, I mean, I guess that's the best possible outcome.
Yeah. If you're an artist, it is.
Yeah. Well, I think that we need to wrap it up, but I really appreciate your time. I had a really good time talking to you, so thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike. This was really fun.
All right, so that was my conversation with Claire A. Warden. It was a really great talk. It was pretty amazing that she picked a topic that just happened to be something so near and dear to my heart, and also something that I've spent so much time thinking about recently. Anyway, if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to write in podcast@keepthechannelopen.com. And you can find more of Claire's work as well as her artist statements, which you should definitely check out at her website, claireawarden.com. You can also find me and the show on Twitter at ChannelOpenPod or on Facebook at facebook.com/keepthechanneleopen. If you like what we're doing here, you can subscribe on iTunes, on Stitcher, pretty much anywhere that you can get your podcasts. You can also, if you really like what we're doing, you can leave a review or a rating on iTunes, and that helps out the show a lot. Our theme music is by Poddington Bear. You can find more of his music available for licensing at soundofpicture.com. Next week, our guest will be science fiction and fantasy author Daniel Abraham, so you can look forward to that. And in the meantime, remember, keep the channel open.